Well, good afternoon, everybody. Brian Salter here with Salter Racing Engines, and this video you're about to see, couldn't get my microphones to work right. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, turn the volume up and you can hear it pretty clear. Hope so. Anyways, this video is about engine performance, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and all that stuff. Don't forget to we have some apparel online, salterracing.itemorder.com. Thank you very much and enjoy the video. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of engine performance, and like I said last week, I'm talking about in detail about all these sensors. And just because I want this to be a foundational thing for other classes, we're going to start at the beginning. I'll go very quickly through it, and I'll try not going to pull out a ton of visual today, but we'll see. So, engine needs 5 things to run.
Air.
It's fuel and air,
Spark.
ignition source, compression, and timing. The old cliche of 3 things to run is not true. It needs compression and timing too, so I always throw that in. It needs 5 things. And even if it's a diesel where it doesn't have a spark plug, how does diesel fuel ignite? Compression and heat. Alright? You squeeze diesel hard enough, diesel fuel, it explodes. So that's why diesel engines have such high compression ratios. Now, with that being said, we're going to start at the top as to how do we develop and get where we are with the sophisticated fuel systems we have today. And it all started with the carburetor. And the deal is, there's multiple designs of carburetors. All right, so you have the downdraft, updraft, side draft, and all that means is the air inlet in relation to the throttle shaft. So if this is your throttle blade, right, and it's inside the carburetor, well, let me turn that angle because that always makes more sense. There's your throttle shaft, and let's say this is the engine right here. This will be what kind of carburetor?
Side draft.
A side draft, right? And that's all it means. If this throttle blade was turned here, it would be an updraft. If it's a typical carburetor on a performance engine, it'd be a downdraft. If it had a blower on top of the carburetor, it'd be a blow-through, right? So very simple, not complicated. But how do carburetors work? Because this is the funny part. Is I've had these, like I said, this new group in town. This is a long time ago. They apparently the guy's grandmother had a ton of money, and she left him, I don't know, several $1 million. So he opens up a performance shop that he really did not have the skill to do, but he had money, so he did it. And they did this elaborate so-called build on a 77 Trans Am. I'll never forget it. And I get the phone call, hey, Mr. Salter, can you help us out? I said, what are you talking about? So they had this 403 Oldsmobile in the Trans Am. That was a common back in that particular model. And they said that the car has no power. We think it's running out of fuel on the chassis dyno. I'm like, well, wait a minute. The car only made 180 horsepower according to the textbooks back then. So what do you mean it had no power? And they put this big whopping cam in it and didn't do anything else. So I go over there and I check it out. And I said, well, let's see how much compression you have. And the compression was like 125 pounds. All right. I said, what did you say the compression ratio was on this engine? They're like, oh, well, it should be 10.5 to 1. I said, well, you got 125 cranking PSI. What size cam is in this engine? And they put a ginormous camshaft in this engine. And it was bleeding the compression off, because that's what they do. That's why you need a lot of static compression and put in a larger cam because your valves are open longer, so you don't have the compression. Now the cam will get more efficient as the RPM grows, and it will build more cylinder pressure. But off the line, that idle and cranking, it had no cylinder pressure. I said, guys, that's not going to work. You don't have enough. They didn't have 10-to-1. They did not even have that. I think it might have been barely 9-to-1. I don't even think it was 9-to-1. So I convinced them. They were very young. I said, look, you got to put a much smaller cam in this engine because you don't have the compression. They put a much smaller cam in. Compression went to 180. Okay. Now the thing runs pretty solid. It's pretty snappy for what it was. And so I that was like a week later, and I'm at the shop maybe 2 weeks later. I get another call from them. Hey, Mr. Salter, this thing, can you help us out? So I go there. What's the problem? We think it's running out of gas. Oh, okay. They're on the chassis down there with it. And I said, well, let me see. So they crank it up, and I hear this. I said, what is that? And they had this Holley electric pump big enough to feed 1,000 horsepower going to this probably 350 horsepower engine, to be honest. I said, why do you have such a pump on this car? Well, it's running out of fuel, so it's getting lean. And that's what they said. They said it was going lean. I said, wait a minute, guys, you don't understand carburetors. That fuel pump, number one, does not need to be on this car. Number two, it's obnoxious. Number three, the stock fuel pump is more than enough to feed this horsepower requirement. So here's what you don't understand. They were young, so they were all into EFI. They thought that by increasing the pressure and volume to the carburetor that was going to fix the lean problem. I can't make this up. I said, no, guys. The carburetor runs off of a bowl. Alright? So you have a bowl with the carburetor. It don't matter what draft it is. Diagonal draft, it doesn't matter. It's going to have a bowl that contains fuel. Right? It will have that. And what it does is it draws off of that bowl. Let's make that blue. And let's say this is a typical carburetor. So in the bottom of the bowl somewhere, hopefully mounted on the side, not the bottom, because the old carburetors put their jets dead on the bottom of the carburetor, and it would just fill with trash. And what we would do to get it out is we would cross the plug wires on the car and rev it up, and it would backfire through the carburetor and blow the trash out of the jets. And that worked really well for old carburetors. It did not work too well. Well, it worked well for all of them, but on the older Holleys, you would blow the power valve out if you weren't careful. And then Holley figured it out, and they put an anti-blow valve in it and that kind of thing. But yeah, we used to cross the plug wires, and it would backfire and blow pressure through the jet internally and knock the trash out. It works awesome. Great old trick. Huh? What?
How does that work?
Because when you cross the plug wires, right, you're firing the cylinder with the intake valve open.
Ah, okay.
Because it's not in time.
Okay.
You're not crossing all of them, just one or two.
I say my brain didn't want to comprehend
Yeah,
why
so
exactly.
you would cross the wire and make it spark on the ignition stroke, basically, where the intake valve was open, and when it fired, it would shoot up the intake, and there's the carburetor, so it's going through that. And it would blow the trash out of the carburetor. It works really well on older stuff. But you have this bowl that the pump feeds. It only needs like 5 to 6 psi pressure. Now here's your jet, and then a lot of times, like on a Holley, you'll have a metering block, and it'll have sometimes little orifices in the center of it, and a power valve sometimes. And we're not trying to get all deep into it, but basically you got a pathway that will turn up like this in the metering block, and then into the main body you have a booster. Okay, and so the booster, don't need to be that long. And then here would be your throttle blade. We'll make it like that because we got to put our base plate on. Alright, so this venturi would be in the carburetor. Wow. That throttle blade's a lot bigger than the... Anyways, let's fix this here. So this would be like a venturi to allow air to come in. Alright, there we go. As air travel as the engine runs, it's a vacuum pump, right? So air would come in, top of the carburetor, and as it passed through the booster, guess what it did? It siphoned fuel out of the bulb. And depending on the jet size is how much fuel could get through. So it would pull a vacuum on this booster and fuel would go up through this tunnel and disperse itself out of the booster. Now, a carburetor must have a vacuum signal at all times to pull for the engine to pull fuel out of it, okay? What happens when you crack the throttle? Like, I mean, when I say crack the throttle, that's a racer's term, whatever. But when you step on that gas pedal, what happens momentarily inside the intake? Because remember, in order to have a vacuum, I have to have some kind of a air in and air out, but it has to be somewhat restricted to keep a vacuum, right? So if I open the throttle plate momentarily, what happens in the intake?
You get a rush of air through there.
No, momentarily. Before that. Before that happens, I have no signal to the carburetor. I will have no vacuum to the carburetor momentarily. So if I crack this throttle, right, if I take it from, like right now it's at idle, and now I step on the gas pedal, and now my throttle blades are vertical, right? Momentarily, I will not have a signal to the carburetor. It's only for a moment. I'm talking milliseconds. So if I don't have a good vacuum signal pulling fuel in for just a millisecond, what's the engine going to do until the fuel gets caught up to the cylinders?
Stumble.
It's going to stumble real bad. So how do we compensate for that? We compensate with that with what's called the accelerator pump. Alright? And every carburetor will have some sort of, well, not all of them, the really old ones didn't, some of them. But what it is, you'll have this little device up here with little squirters on it. And when you step on the throttle, it will manually pump fuel down the throat of that carburetor. Manually. The reason you have the accelerator pump is because when you crack the throttle blade, there's no vacuum signal. And it's just a moment, but it's enough to make the engine just want to die for a second. Like this, and it just falling in until the fuel gets caught up, until the engine starts receiving the fuel again. So, this was the downfall of carburetors. What's other cons of a carburetor? Well, we're talking about engine performance, meaning the design of an engine using a carburetor. What are the pros and cons? Well, the pros are it's much cheaper. The other pro is you can do a lot of things to a carburetor and make that thing do really well. You can put multiple carburetors on, and it's still cheaper than fuel injection. It's way simpler. It's no wiring involved, no computer involved. It's a little bit, if you're a carburetor expert, like I consider myself an expert, I love them because I don't have problems with them. I know how to fix them. But if you don't know how to fix a carburetor, you could be, it's like being on the moon. Alright, because you don't know what to do. The problem with a carburetor is as you change altitude, the oxygen gets less. So now my jet sizing is wrong. And that could be altitude going higher or lower, right? As the cold weather gets super cold, I need more fuel than what I need in 90-degree air. And the jet size is what? It's fixed. It's manually screwed in there. That is the downfall, the major downfall. One major downfall is that the carburetor was designed for so many CFM to pass through it, and it's designed to, that jet is designed to go with that amount of airflow. But the airflow in a carburetor situation is kind of altitude dependent. Alright, so if you have very dense air or very non-dense air, like hot, dry, no, just light air, you need to lean it out. If you have very dense air, it might be heavy, oxygen, colder, whatever, you need a lot more fuel. And with the carburetor, you don't have the ability to do that, except for changing the jets. We can mechanically fix that and get it perfect again, but we have to, minorly take it apart and adjust that. All right. The other major downfall to a carburetor is what? It's centrally located, isn't it? So you have long runners, you have short runners. And it could be on the inline 6, inline 4, inline 5, V8, doesn't matter. One carburetor is centrally located. So therefore you have what? Uneven air-fuel distribution. That is its major flaw. Well, actually nowadays, because you got to understand, just like carburetors had a evolution, EFI has evolved. EFI nowadays is just phenomenal. Okay, phenomenal. But the original OBD1 EFI, which came out in about '85, it wasn't that great, and they were still using centrally mounted throttle bodies, right? The modern day EFI 2020s, right? That thing is it's in a world of its own. All right, so centrally located, you have to do everything mechanically, but definitely cheaper, and you can get really close to equal performance. I'm telling you what, guys, there are some carburetor men out there that are way better than me that it's hard to beat the performance of that carburetor. No, I don't care what EFI you have. Because here's the thing, we're talking about fuel systems. I'm not talking about taking your EFI and controlling ignition timing or controlling cam phasing. We ain't talking about that. We're talking about just delivering the fuel. It is hard to beat a top-notch carburetor. Okay? I'll tell you, some of the guys that worked at RCR and people like that, Bolaws, BLB, the guy at VDL, those guys are phenomenal. Pro Systems, one of the best drag carburetors you can buy. But phenomenal carburetor guys, that I'm telling you. Just top of the game. And it would be hard for a EFI to beat that. Now it could equal it, but to beat that it'd be hard to do. Now the cool thing about EFI is what else? It controls a lot of other things. And that's where it just excels. And plus you can go with tune runners and all that jazz. So we'll talk about all that too. So there's your evolution of a carburetor. Now an engine is a vacuum pump, okay? So it pulled on the carburetor. And the carburetor responded because it's a siphoning tube, essentially, with a bulb and a jet. So if you remove that, and now let's go to electronic fuel injection, how in the world do you know how much fuel to put in the engine? And that's where we are. You see, when you stepped on the gas pedal, the throttle blade would open and the air would be allowed to enter in at a rapid rate, passing by the booster, pulling in the fuel. But you don't have that anymore. You now have just a throttle body, because we're going to skip the TBI stuff. That's
Just.
alright. You now have a throttle body. So you have a throttle body that could look like just a square box with a shaft and a blade in it. And it could be a double blade, it could be an oval blade, I don't care. It's a throttle blade. Allows air to go in, okay? Or doesn't. So from the front view, you know, it might just be what you see inside of there. That's probably all you're going to see. Or if it's an old tune port, you know, it might be something more like this way. You know, that kind of thing. Alright? So, alright, we got throttle body, lets air in. We have an intake, and it could be, gosh man, it could be all kinds of designs. You could have one big common plenum with equal length runners. Alright, we're dealing with a 3-cylinder today. Alright. How does it know? And by the way, if I was designing this system, here's where my fuel injector would be. I'm going to put my fuel injector right there. I'm gonna build one of these days and put my name on it. I would not put it down here at the cylinder head. I put it up here at the top. You say why? Because of airflow disturbances. And I'll talk about that later on. Anyhow, how does it know?
Sensors.
Sensors. Okay. Boy, are there a lot of sensors? Yes, there are. Let's talk about those sensors. We're going to make a list of them and talk about each one. So the EFI, it knows about how much fuel to deliver based off of sensors. So sensors are important. So the first sensor that is obviously in our face, or will be in our face, is what?
Mass airflow sensor.
That's not on the board. What's obviously in your face right now?
Throttle position sensor.
Okay. TPS, throttle position sensor. And yes, Logan is right. It would be the mass airflow. It's a big deal. We're going to talk about that, of course. That's got to be part. Well, it don't have to be. There's two types: mass airflow and speed density. But we will definitely talk about it. So, throttle position sensor. What does that sensor do?
Senses the position of the throttle blade.
Correct. It knows how much you're stepping on the gas pedal. And because these throttle bodies are a certain diameter, certain size, we know through simple mathematics that if the hole is this big and it's cracked this much, that we know it has the capability of flowing this much air. So based on that, the engineer can say, well, if we're open at 20% throttle, then I know this much air has the capability of coming in, and I'm going to program that in my EEPROM, which means programmable memory. That's what's in your computer. And the engineer can say, we're going to have this much duty cycle of injector pulse, and we'll run this big of an injector, this many cc's, or this many, whatever volume they want to use, based off of 60 psi or whatever they choose. Okay, now we start getting complicated and things start going up in price. The one sensor that every EFI system has is what? Obviously that's it, that's one. We have to know this. You have to know that. What's one that you also have to know? Huh? No, you don't have to know that, but it's good to. And all of them have it nowadays. She said the intake air temp. All right, I'll make that here. Intake air temperature sensor. That's a little lower on the. Huh? MAP. MAP. What is the MAP?
Manifold absolute pressure.
Manifold absolute pressure. That has to be on every electronic EFI system. That would be considered speed density. It uses intake manifold vacuum, okay, as the main contributor to what's going on with this EFI. It can run off of mass airflow, but they're always together, mass airflow and MAP. But you can do away with mass airflow, you have to have the MAP. Okay? Why? Because remember I said the engine is an air pump? Remember I said when you crack that throttle blade and you momentarily lose that vacuum signal and the carburetor will force fuel in? Well, guess what? You still momentarily lose the vacuum signal when you crack the throttle blade on EFI. And the MAP sensor will pick that up. Yes?
There are some EFI cars that don't use a MAP sensor. Mine's one of them.
Really?
Yes, they calculate the manifold vacuum and compensate through it via a failed MAP table in the ECU. So you have to calibrate that in order to fix your snap throttle problems like what you're
Is that aftermarket or is that
It's factory.
it's factory?
It's factory.
Well, I was going to get to the point that they have now mass airflow meters that have barometric sensors in them. But they started doing that actually a long time ago. But you can get a mass airflow meter that all of that is in the mass airflow meter. To word it simply, instead of just individual separate sensors. But you have to have that reading. See, what you're telling me is this, maybe the physical sensor's not there, but they're still calculating it. You have to know that.
Yeah, you have to know it.
So again, I'm still right. Thank you very much. So the MAP sensor, it has to be there. Huh? Oh. No, there is so many changes, guys. I'm telling you right now, especially with this direct injection stuff. Wait till you get to that. You have to know what's going on in the intake. Why? Because, like I said, when you momentarily lose that vacuum signal because you stepped on the gas pedal, that computer has to immediately, without you noticing it, compensate the fuel delivery so the engine doesn't, bog or try to die or any of that. So, like Logan said, now they got some really fancy schmancy sensors that will calculate it and predict it, but that number or that info has to be there. It has to know, or even think it knows, what's going on in the intake, or it just won't function correctly at all. So I'm going to move to IT a minute. What's another one that absolutely has to be there? How about the hard starts on a carburetor when it's 20 degrees outside? Why are they hard to start? Because it doesn't know how much temperature is outside, does it? So I know growing up with those things, I would have to pump the gas pedal 10 times, start it up, then not run good, and then you pump it 5 or 6 more times, and then finally you could get it to where you could hold it at 2,000 RPMs or so until it got warm enough to idle on its own. You had to manually compensate for the cold weather by pumping fuel down in the intake, because you had such dense air, it was so cold, it needed a lot more fuel to compensate for that. Okay, now, with that being said, how does the EFI?
Take your temperature.
No. Don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. No, what? ECT!
Oh, yeah.
Come on, man.
Temp sensor, yeah.
Engine coolant temp sensor. It must know what that is. And there's more reasons than just what I gave. The other reason is open and closed loop. It cannot go into closed loop unless that ECT is telling it the right info. Along with the catalytic converter and other things, but still. It must have the ECT. It needs to know that it's 15 degrees, right? So that it can bump up the duty cycle on the injectors. And by the way, the older systems, and maybe some new ones too still have it, but the older OBD1 stuff, they would have a cold start injector in the middle of the intake. Nissans were notorious for that, okay? They would put one injector right here in the center of the plenum, and when it was super cold, that injector would spray extra fuel in the intake just to get the thing started, because it was so cold. Alright? So it has to know the engine temperature. Now you guys have mentioned, let me stay on track here. So, alright, these are things, GPS, MAP, ECT. Another very important sensor, mass airflow. Let's talk about that in a moment. Mass airflow meter. So you have two types of systems. Mass airflow meter and speed density. Speed density runs off a map. Mass airflow runs off mass airflow. Okay? You also have mechanical injection. We're not talking about that. We're talking about computers and EFI. How does it know? What does mass airflow meter do?
Measures how much air is being pulled into the engine.
Right. You guys should be giving me definitions you looked up, alright? I need to see some I want to hear something. Like right now, like tell me a definition. Come on.
Measures the amount of air entering the engine.
What I just said.
That is a rinky-dink definition. You're all fired, and now you're rehired, because I need to know. Mass airflow meter. Yes, it measures the amount of air coming in. How does it do that? I told you, I wanted extremely accurate definitions. You can't fix nothing if you don't know what's in the system and what it does. If you know what components are in the system and what each component does, you can fix it. Because all you have to figure out is what's not happening. I fix refrigerators, heating and air conditioning systems. Yes, I'm an engineer, but so what? You are too. You're gonna be.
Full name, mass airflow sensor. It's more commonly known as a mass air or a MAF sensor, air metering, or sometimes simply MAF. While it may have many names, it's responsible for just one, but still a very important job, measuring the amount of air entering the engine. We don't get a better definition, Brian.
Well, I wanted a scientific explanation of what's happening, but that's okay. So what it does is it has lots of ways it does that. It can use a heated wire, and I'll just use the term wire. It's an element. But it can send voltage to this little wire module, and as the air passes across that wire, it measures how fast it cools it down. And by doing so, if it cools it down super fast, engineer knows, well, if it cools down at this speed, then this much air has to be coming in. And if it cools it down at that speed, then this much air must be coming in. So that's how it was designed. And there are a few other ways to do it as well, not just with that, wire method. Also, mass airflow meters can and do come in different diameter sizes. It is important that the engineer, when he designs a mass airflow meter, if you'll notice, those things are hard plastic, or most of them, or aluminum, and they will be a certain size. So, for example, if you're trying to build an engine that makes 580 horsepower at the crank, and you put on a mass airflow meter because that's the system you want to use, and you go get a mass airflow meter off a 1998 Buick V6, do you think that meter is big enough to handle that horsepower requirement? No. Why? Because the mass airflow meter is about that big around. And you need something that's at least 4 inches. You see what I mean? It's not just about mass airflow readings. There's also still a CFM requirement. CFM requirements. Been saying it for months. Okay? An engine must have air just to RPM. Got nothing to do with density. You can tell about that. So, not there again. You want to build a certain amount of power. Now the CFM requirement increases. We can get the air more dense. We're going to make more power, but I still got to have a certain amount of airflow. And that's what that thing does. And he designs it, whoever, the engineer designs a mass airflow meter, you'll notice the sizes will be varying depending on the engine that it's feeding. And we'll move on at this point from that one right now. What's another sensor that's very important? How about the oxygen, right?
Oh.
What does oxygen sensor do?
It measures how much oxygen is pretty much leaving the engine
Okay.
to know how much
Okay.
fuel is being burnt.
It measures basically the amount of oxygen in the exhaust. So why is that important?
You're asking us?
Yeah, I'm asking you. Okay.
Because
Wait a minute, let me redo this again. So why is that important? Does that sound like a statement?
No, that's a question.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes-
Just making sure.
sometimes hypothetical
Didn't know if you were going to go into the
questions
definition.
I know how
yourself,
millennials
you'd
can
ask
be,
us.
just trying. You guys are millennials? What are you?
We're Gen Z.
Gen Zs.
I was
God.
raised by millennials.
I fell off the alphabet table a long time ago.
Yeah, we're all young.
I don't know how you Gen Zers are. With our snappers.
And thought comes to mind, what goes out must go in.
No, that's absolutely not true.
Like a balance kind of
What goes out must go in. No, that'd be wrong. All right.
See how
Anyways,
much
how does it?
fuel-
Why does it measure oxygen? Why is that important?
To see how much fuel you're burning whenever
You're measuring.
combustion stage.
Yeah, exactly. If it's, have you ever seen me test an O2 sensor before? We'll take an O2 sensor, and do you know an O2 sensor creates its own voltage? Okay, that should have been your definition then. I want details. So-
Creates its own voltage. I don't know what else.
How does it do that? What kind of big long word is that material that's inside of it that makes it work? Dilithium crystals.
What did you say?
I don't speak Spanish.
That's not Spanish, that's Star Trek. Anyways, when you take a O2 sensor and like for example, I'll take a torch, a little MAP, butane, propane, whatever. Not a cutting torch, just a flame. Put the O2 sensor in the flame, and you can take your multimeter and hook it right to the ground and the sensor wire, signal wire, on the O2, and you will see 0 to about 0.9 volts. It generates it on its own. When I put it in the flame and completely submerge the sensor bulb of the O2 sensor, if I completely submerge that in the flame, it's going to produce that it's not seeing any oxygen at all. Okay, so if it's not seeing any oxygen, then what's happening? What does it do? You should know this.
No oxygen means it's rich, so it's going to be high.
It's going to produce a voltage when it doesn't see oxygen. So, in the vehicle, when you're looking at O2 sensor on live data, if you see high numbers, you got a very, what?
Rich mixture.
Rich mixture. If you see very low numbers, you get a very lean mixture. What you should see is going low to high, flickering all over the map. Why? Because the computers nowadays, I'm talking right this second, are so fast, they can change. I mean, some of these things are doing 1,000 reads a second. Okay? So, the O2 sensor, actually, some of them can barely keep up. But you can change the fuel pulse to such a degree that it maintains 14.7 stoichiometric air-fuel ratio perfectly, and that O2 sensor is all over the map, and that's how it should be. Okay? And then there's other ways to check a catalytic converter by checking post-cat O2 sensor readings and all these things that you'll learn about. But yeah, the oxygen sensor should be all over the place. Alright? And that tells you everything's happy, everything's working like it's supposed to. If you see one that's really lazy, because they can just be lazy, it's probably time for a new one. They do have time limits. Now, a lot of guys will never change them. Guys will never change them. And used to be OBD1 stuff, I'm talking late 80s or early 90s, they were part of a service. 30 or 60,000 mile, 90,000 mile, they had what they call an emissions service. We had to go in and just put on O2 sensors and spark plugs and on filters and that kind of thing. So, lots changed over the years. The old days, the O2 sensor had one wire, and one of the main signs that it was going bad is your car would surge. You would try to hold the throttle steady at, say, 60 miles an hour, and you could feel the car surge. And you didn't get check engine lights like you do now. And we would go out there and unplug the O2 sensor and then drive it again. The symptom would completely go away. It would almost verify you had a bad O2 sensor. The main test was we take the sensor, put it in a flame, see if we got a voltage. If we didn't, or if it didn't go all the way, we would put a new sensor in. And of course, back then they were cheap. They weren't like $500 and all that kind of stuff, you know. So, one wire O2 sensors, yeah. The modern stuff is very good. And we're usually using 2 sensors per bank. So, if you got a V8, you're going to have about 4 sensors in it. Some of them maybe more, depending on the new stuff coming out. Very important though. It is almost your quality control, if you will, of the EFI. I like to look at it that way because why? It is at the tail end of what's happened prior to this. It says, hey computer, all those guys up there are doing a pretty good job. Here's what I'm seeing. And the computer can make a fine-tuned adjustment, you know, as a last resort. Alright? So, we were just now scratching the surface. What else we got? Somebody said intake air. Why is intake air temperature sensor important? Because what if my engine gets to 195 degrees, which now heat soaks my intake manifold, and heat soaks everything in the engine, but yet I'm driving in an environment where the air is 20 degrees. Right? Because if the computer thinks that the air coming in is 195, it's going to run it lean, isn't it? But if I'm in a very cold environment and the engine bay is really hot, but the air inlet stuff is very cold, I've now got a conflict. My computer is trying to run the car like it's 195 degrees, but the air coming in is 20 degrees. So we have really nice dense air coming in with a hotter engine. And this is the reason that these are important. They really help give the computer a sense of where to take that AFR, the air-fuel ratio. They really balance it out. Yep. Not all the EFIs, especially in the early days, not all of them had that. And in the early days, they didn't make a big impact. But they are much more relied on now than they used to be. Alright? What else? Is this enough right here to control EFI and do a really good job? The answer is yes. This is enough. Wait a minute. Okay, this is electronic fuel injection, right?
Where's the fuel?
Yeah.
Well, the fuel, we'll get to that later. But, wait a minute. How does the computer know when the throttle blade is open and how far? Okay. What does an engine need? Air, fuel, ignition, compression, and timing. Okay, so am I just turning on all the injectors at once and dumping fuel in my intake? Like the old batch fire Mustang or something? Yes.
Sensor.
Crankshaft and camshaft position sensor.
Exactly. That is the timing. I have to have, and I'll just write it right here. The crankshaft and camshaft position sensor. Now, the cam spins at what speed? Half the speed of the crank. Why do I need these two sensors? Because I want to fire the injector on what? The intake stroke. There is such a thing as a batch fire, but basically you've got a glorified carburetor. They work great, but they can be much better, and they are. And that's why we don't use batch fire much at all. So, by taking the computer now, by taking a signal from the crank position sensor and the signal from the cam position sensor, it can know what stroke it is on. Not just that the crank came around and every cylinder where it's at, but it can know what stroke it's on and when to deliver the injector pulse. And these, you ain't going nowhere without them. Because if I'm desperate, I'll get me a tube of ether and some kind of rubber hose and rig up a hole in my intake and sit in the car and spray it and drive where I'm going. I'll make my own fuel delivery. Oh yes, I can do some crazy crap, let me tell you. But if I ain't got these two things, I ain't going nowhere. It ain't going to do nothing without them two things on Modern EFI. Even if you want to adapt your old carbureted engine to fuel injection, what is the one thing you have to do? You have to give it some signal from the ignition so it knows what's going on. And it always has an ignition that comes with a kit of some sort, whether it's a distributor, whether it's a module plug-in, whatever it is. EFI systems must have a signal from the cam or crank. Must. Or they don't know what to do. And that's why they cost a lot more. That's why they're more complicated. They have higher fuel pressures. You know, they just, but are they accurate and are they great? Yes, they are. When a person who is feeble, who cannot physically do anything, but maybe, you know, because maybe the world's not been fair, they can get in a wheelchair and roll themselves to the car. When that kind of person in 0-degree weather can hit a button and that car starts and they can have heat, that is a good thing. Or if you're 95-year-old grandma or grandpa who can't do anything anymore, can go get in that car no matter the weather and hit that button and it start and run on its own without them having to fight and pump the carburetor and, you know, suck on gas fumes up in the carport for 2 days. When they can get in there and hit that button and the car start, that's a good thing. It's all because of this. When you learn everything about these sensors, and then there's more, but when you learn everything about these, and know what they do and know where they are, you're going to be a good tech. You're going to be able to fix anything on a car related to this. Alright, cool. Let's take a break.